At the exact moment the world was told the war might be slowing down, Tehran was still being hit, not hours later, not after negotiations failed. At the same time, explosions were reported over the city just as Washington was signaling major progress. A delay had been announced. 5 days. A strike on Iran's power grid, postponed. It sounded like a step back from escalation, but the battlefield did not respond. Because while one narrative was forming, another one was already in motion. Israel confirmed it was striking Tehran. Iran denied there were any talks at all. And suddenly the war was no longer moving forward in a straight line. It was splitting into two realities, one where diplomacy exists, and one where the bombs never stopped. The defining image of March 23 is not a statement. It is not a press briefing. It is not a diplomatic phrase carefully chosen for international consumption. It is impact. Reuters confirmed that even as Washington was describing progress in contacts with Iran, Israeli forces were actively conducting airstrikes in Tehran. That overlap is not a detail. It is the event itself. Because modern air operations do not simply happen. They are prepared in layers. Target selection, route planning, timing coordination, electronic support, and strike sequencing. When those strikes are executed over a capital, they are not spontaneous reactions. They are decisions already locked into motion, which means that by the time diplomatic language reached global audiences, the military reality had already been decided. This is the key to understanding the moment. The war did not pause to allow diplomacy to begin. Diplomacy appeared while the war was still actively unfolding. Reports of explosions over Tehran, followed by emergency responses and localized disruptions, reinforced a single point. The operational tempo had not been interrupted, and that changes how every signal must be read. Because if a strike continues during a moment of supposed progress, then the progress itself becomes uncertain. It may be real, it may be tactical, or it may be something else entirely. Pressure delivered through contradiction. Tehran is not just a geographic location. It is the center of Iran's political and strategic architecture. Pressure applied here does not remain local. It echoes through the entire system. Government coordination flows through Tehran. Military command structures connect through it. Communications, logistics, and national-level decision-making all intersect within this space. That is why even limited strikes near or around the capital carry disproportionate weight. They are not only about destruction, they are about access. They demonstrate that the center is within reach. And in strategic terms, that matters more than damage assessments. Because once reach is established, every future decision must account for it. Air defenses must be redistributed. Critical assets must be hardened or moved. Redundancy becomes urgent. Reaction time shortens. This creates pressure not just on infrastructure but on leadership itself. And that pressure becomes more complex when it appears alongside diplomatic signaling. Because now the question is no longer just what was hit, but why now? Why strike the capital while signaling progress? Why maintain military tempo while suggesting a possible agreement? Tehran becomes the place where that contradiction is no longer theoretical. It is visible. And once it becomes visible, it begins to influence everything else, from military planning to global perception. The most important weapon revealed in this timeline is not a missile or aircraft. It is systemic pressure. On March 23rd, that pressure took multiple forms at once. First, there were active airstrikes, visible, immediate, kinetic. Second, there was a planned escalation that did not occur. Yet, President Trump stated that a strike on Iran's electrical grid had been delayed by 5 days following what he described as productive exchanges. That statement is critical because it introduces a different category of warfare. A power grid is not a tactical target. It is a national system. Disrupting it affects hospitals, transport, communications, and industrial activity simultaneously. It is an escalation from targeting locations to targeting function. Iran's response, through IRGC messaging reported by Reuters, mirrored that logic. Any attack on its electrical infrastructure could be met with strikes on Israeli power facilities and systems supporting U.S. bases. That is not retaliation in the traditional sense. It is reciprocal system targeting. So what emerges here is a new layer of warfare. Not just strike and counterstrike, but system against system. Energy networks, infrastructure grids, and national functionality becoming part of the battlefield. And once that threshold is approached, the conflict changes scale, even before a single grid is actually hit. When warfare moves into systems, defense becomes something more complex than interception. It becomes resilience. Air defense can stop incoming threats, but it cannot fully protect an interconnected electrical network from cumulative disruption. A single strike may be absorbed. Multiple strikes across key nodes can begin to degrade performance in ways that are difficult to reverse quickly. That is why infrastructure targeting is so sensitive, because it shifts the objective from immediate destruction to gradual weakening. And defending against that requires layered capability, redundancy in power generation, protection of transmission nodes, rapid repair teams, hardened communication systems, and continuous monitoring. At the same time, military installations, especially U.S. bases in the region, depend on similar systems. They require stable power, communications, and logistical support to function effectively. That is why Iran's warning about targeting facilities linked to U.S. bases is strategically significant. It signals that the battlefield is expanding into support networks. And once support networks become targets, the distinction between frontline and rear area begins to collapse. Everything becomes part of the operational environment, and everything becomes vulnerable to pressure. The importance of this moment is not just what was struck, it is what was being signaled at the same time. On March 23rd, multiple layers of pressure converged. Military strikes over Tehran, threats against electrical systems, diplomatic messaging suggesting progress, Iran denying any negotiations, Hormuz remaining tied to conditions of de-escalation. Each of these alone would be significant. Together, they form a strategic pattern. The goal is not simply to damage or deter. It is to compress decision-making, to force the opposing side into a narrower window of choices, continue resisting and absorb more pressure, engage diplomatically under unfavorable conditions, or escalate further into a more dangerous phase. Hormuz amplifies this pressure because it is not just a regional waterway. It is a global energy artery. If the conflict disrupts it, the consequences are immediate and international. And that is why the Tehran strikes cannot be viewed in isolation. They are part of a wider system of pressure that extends from the battlefield to global markets. The most important consequence of these events is structural. The war is no longer sequential. It is simultaneous. Diplomacy and combat are now occurring at the same time, not in alternating phases. This creates instability because it breaks the traditional signals that states rely on. A delay no longer guarantees de-escalation. A statement no longer confirms intent. An attack no longer proves that diplomacy has failed. Everything overlaps. This forces decision-makers to operate under uncertainty. And uncertainty increases risk, because responses may be based on incomplete or misleading interpretations. A delayed strike could be read as weakness or as preparation. A continued airstrike could be read as escalation or as leverage. And when both interpretations are possible, Miscalculation becomes more likely. This is where modern warfare becomes most dangerous, not when escalation is clear, but when it is ambiguous. Global markets reacted immediately. Oil prices dropped after the announcement of a delay in attacking Iran's power grid. That movement suggested temporary relief, a belief that escalation might slow. But that relief did not hold. When Iran denied there had been any talks, the narrative shifted again. Oil prices moved upward. Volatility returned. Markets were no longer reacting to physical disruption alone. They were reacting to conflicting signals. Stocks rose, bonds adjusted, currency markets shifted, all within hours. This kind of movement reflects uncertainty, not stability. Because markets do not wait for clarity. They price risk in real time. And on March 23rd, risk was defined by contradiction. The next phase will be shaped by what happens within the 5-day delay. 3 scenarios emerge. First, stabilization. Diplomatic channels, formal or indirect, continue. The delayed strike remains suspended. Military activity narrows. The situation stabilizes without a formal agreement. Second, escalation. The delay expires without progress. The planned infrastructure strike returns. Iran responds in kind. The conflict shifts into system-level confrontation. Third, miscalculation. Signals are misread. Actions are taken based on incorrect assumptions. The conflict accelerates beyond what either side initially intended. This third path is the most dangerous because it does not require a deliberate decision. It only requires misunderstanding. What we are seeing is not the end of escalation. It is a change in how escalation works. War is no longer a sequence. It is an overlap. And in that overlap, certainty disappears. Because when diplomacy and destruction happen at the same time, every signal becomes unreliable. And when signals cannot be trusted, decisions become risk. Not calculated risk, but interpretive risk. And that is where modern conflict becomes most unstable.